For centuries, when the world looked at the Philippines, it saw a footnote, a collection of islands passed between empires, a strategic port for trade, a minor detail in the grand histories written by others. The name itself, the Philippines, was a tribute to a foreign king, Philip II of Spain, a monarch who never even set foot on its shores. This was a land defined not by its own people, but by its colonizers. To the Spanish, who ruled for over 300 years, it was a distant outpost of their empire and a source of goods for the galleons sailing to Acapulco. To the Americans who followed, it was a territory of little brown brothers, a people they deemed unprepared for self-governance, and a stepping stone for American ambitions in Asia. The perception was one of passivity, a nation to be acted upon, not one that acted itself. They saw docility, but missed the embers of defiance. They saw piety, but missed the revolutionary fervor brewing just beneath the surface. They saw a chain of islands, but missed the unbreakable chain of a national spirit being forged in the fires of oppression. This is the story of the moments that shattered that illusion. The moments the world was forced to stop, look again, and realize the Philippines wasn't a joke, it wasn't a footnote. It was a sleeping giant, and it was about to wake up. To really get how big this awakening was, you have to understand the perception that held the Philippines captive for so long. It wasn't just a lack of recognition. It was a whole narrative of condescension, a story written by outsiders who saw the islands and their people as secondary characters in their own global drama. Picture a world history book from the 18th century. Europe gets whole chapters. China and India, ancient empires, get their due. But the Philippines, it might show up as a quick stop on a trade route, a dot on a map labeled Spanish East Indies. For 333 years, the identity of the islands was tied to Madrid. The colony's purpose was mostly economic and religious. The famous Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, which ran for 250 years, turned Manila into a hub of commerce between Asia and the Americas. But the wealth flowed through it, not to its people. It was a pipeline for imperial profit, and Filipinos were often seen as little more than laborers and converts. Spanish accounts from the era often painted the native population as childlike, lazy, or in need of firm guidance from the church and the crown. This was a convenient narrative because it justified the whole colonial project. After all, if a people are deemed incapable of governing themselves, then their subjugation isn't conquest, it's salvation. This idea seeped into the global consciousness. The Philippines wasn't a nation of patriots, it was a flock to be tended. Then came the turn of the 20th century, and with it, a new master. After the Spanish-American War, Spain sold the Philippines to the United States for $20 million in the 1898 Treaty of Paris. If the Spanish view was one of paternalistic dominance, the American one was benevolent assimilation. This policy, declared by President William McKinley, framed colonization as a noble mission to educate, civilize, and uplift the Filipino people. This era gave us one of the most patronizing phrases in colonial history, the little brown brother. Coined by William Howard Taft, the first American Governor-General, the term perfectly summed up the American perception. It reflected what historians call paternalist racism. It suggested a family bond, but one between a wise older brother, America, and a young, immature sibling, the Philippines, who needed constant guidance. Taft himself wrote that Filipinos would need 50 or 100 years of American supervision to develop anything like Anglo-Saxon political principles. This attitude was everywhere. American soldiers in the Philippine-American War, a brutal conflict that broke out when Filipinos resisted their new colonizers, scoffed at Taft's phrase, creating their own marching song with the line, "He may be a brother of Big Bill Taft, but he ain't no brother of mine. The message was clear. The Filipino was seen as subordinate, an object of a civilizing mission, not an equal. Mark Twain, a fierce critic of American colonization, put it bluntly. I have read carefully the Treaty of Paris, and I have seen that we do not intend to free, but to subjugate the people of the Philippines. We have gone there to conquer, not to redeem. For decades, this was the story. The Philippines was America's ward, its pupil, its strategic outpost. Its people were known for their hospitality, music, and faith, gentle, pleasing qualities. But fierce independence, political genius, or world-changing courage? Those words were rarely part of the international conversation. The world saw the Philippines as a beautiful land with friendly faces, but not as a source of political inspiration or a nation capable of shaping its own destiny, let alone influencing others. It was a perception built on centuries of being owned, managed, and defined by foreign powers. But a nation's spirit can't be colonized forever. A breaking point was coming, and it came not just once, but in a series of earth-shattering moments that forced the world to sit up and take notice. These were the moments when the little brother stood up, looked the world in the eye, and proved he was a brother to no one but a master of his own house. The first real crack in the colonial facade wasn't a quiet fissure. It was a thunderous explosion of revolutionary will. It was the moment the Filipino people, after more than 3 centuries of Spanish rule, stopped whispering their complaints and started shouting for their freedom. The year is 1896. While Europe's great powers are carving up the globe, a secret revolutionary society called the Katipunan is spreading like wildfire across the Philippine archipelago. Its goal is nothing short of independence, a concept so audacious that to the Spanish Empire it was unthinkable. For 300 years there had been revolts, but they were often small and disconnected. The Katipunan was different. It was a national awakening. The revolution that followed was brutal and hard-fought. It was a war of farmers with bolos against soldiers with rifles, a testament to sheer human will against imperial might. And then came the moment that should have changed everything. On June 12, 1898, in Kawit, Cavite, a Filipino general named Emilio Aguinaldo stood on the balcony of his home and proclaimed Philippine independence. The newly created Filipino flag was unfurled for the first time, its sun with 8 rays representing the first provinces to rise against Spain. The national anthem, Marcha Nacional Filipina, was played, its soaring melody a declaration of nationhood. Let the weight of this moment sink in. This wasn't just a declaration. It was the birth of the first Philippine Republic, Asia's first constitutional republic. While much of the continent was still under colonial rule, this archipelago of so-called docile subjects had organized a government and drafted a constitution, the Malolos Constitution. It was a remarkably progressive document for its time, establishing a government that was popular, representative, and responsible, with a clear separation of powers. They had proven themselves capable of the very self-governance their colonizers had denied them for centuries, but the world, in its imperial arrogance, chose to look away. At the very same time, Spain was losing the Spanish-American War. The Filipino revolutionaries had fought alongside the Americans, believing they were allies in their quest for freedom. It was a fatal miscalculation. In the halls of power in Paris, far from the battlefields, Spain and the United States were drawing up a treaty. The Philippines was sold like property from one empire to another for 20 million. The Filipino representative, Felipe Agoncillo, wasn't even allowed in the room where his nation's fate was being decided. The declaration of June 12th was ignored. The first republic in Asia was denied recognition. The world, led by the US, had decided the Philippines was not ready. The joke continued, but now it was a cruel one. The promise of freedom earned with blood was snatched away with the stroke of a pen. This led to the devastating Philippine-American War, a conflict that cost hundreds of thousands of Filipino lives. America, the nation born from a revolution against an empire, was now crushing another one. So why was this moment so pivotal, even if it ended in heartbreak? Because it was the moment of self-realization. The world may not have recognized the Philippines, but on that day in June 1898, the Filipino people recognized themselves. They had seen what was possible. They had tasted sovereignty. They had proven to themselves that they were a nation. The First Republic may have been short-lived, but it planted a seed that could never be uprooted. It was the first definitive statement on a national scale that the Philippines was not a colonial possession. It was a country, and though it would take nearly another half-century for the world to officially acknowledge it, the journey had begun. The footnote had started writing its own history. If the revolution of 1898 was the fiery birth of the national spirit, the first half of the 20th century was its trial by fire. Under American rule, the Philippines existed in a kind of political limbo. The promise of independence was always there, dangling like a distant prize, eventually formalized by the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934, which scheduled independence for a decade later. A Commonwealth government was established with a Filipino president, Manuel L. Quezon. Filipinos were learning the American style of democracy, building institutions, and preparing for the day they would finally be sovereign. But the shadow of the little brown brother stereotype lingered. The relationship was still one of teacher and student, with America always in the position of authority. Then, the world plunged into the darkness of World War II. The Philippines was brutally invaded and occupied by Imperial Japan in 1941. The promised independence seemed to evaporate overnight. American forces retreated, and General Douglas MacArthur gave his famous promise, "I shall return." But for 3 years, the Filipino people were left to endure a nightmare. This period is maybe the most profound testament to Filipino resilience. Facing starvation, brutal oppression, and the destruction of their homeland, they didn't just surrender. A massive and effective guerrilla resistance rose up across the islands, tying down hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers. These weren't just professional soldiers. They were teachers, farmers, doctors, and students who refused to let their nation's spirit die. They fought in the jungles, sabotaged enemy lines, and provided crucial intelligence, playing a vital role in the country's eventual liberation. The war left the Philippines utterly devastated. Manila, once called the Pearl of the Orient, was the second most destroyed Allied capital city in the world, after Warsaw. The economy was in shambles, and the human cost was staggering. It was out of these ashes that the modern Philippine nation was officially born. On July 4th, 1946, at the Independence Grandstand in Manila, a crowd gathered to witness the moment they had been waiting for since 1898. With solemn ceremony, the American flag was slowly lowered. Then, as the crowd watched with bated breath, the Philippine flag, the same sun and stars raised in Kewit 48 years earlier, was raised in its place. Alone. For the first time, it flew with no other nation's flag beside it, a singular symbol of sovereignty. The United States, through a proclamation by President Harry S. Truman, formally recognized the independence of the Republic of the Philippines. The country was no longer a commonwealth, no longer a territory, no longer a colony. It was an independent republic in the community of nations. However, this independence was complicated. The choice of date, July 4th, the same as American Independence Day, symbolized the continued, almost paternalistic ties. The new republic was heavily dependent on American aid to rebuild, and treaties allowed the U.S. to keep massive military bases on Philippine soil, a source of controversy for decades. Some critics saw it not as true independence, but as a shift to a neo-colonial relationship. The country was still seen in Washington and other world capitals as a junior partner, a dependent ally in the new Cold War. So the world's perception hadn't been completely shattered, but it had fundamentally shifted. The Philippines was no longer a possession on a map. It had a seat at the United Nations. It had its own president, its own foreign policy, its own voice. The world now had to deal with the Philippines, not through governors general from Washington or Madrid, but through its own elected leaders. This moment was less of a fiery explosion and more of a deep, resonant bell tolling the end of an era. It marked the end of over 400 years of direct, formal colonial rule. The Filipino people had endured revolution, a change of masters, and the inferno of a world war. They had earned their flag, and now it flew alone. The world may have still seen a nation in recovery, a nation in America's orbit, but it could no longer deny that it was, finally and irrevocably, a nation. This is the moment. If 1898 was the internal realization of nationhood, and 1946 was the formal entry onto the world stage, then 1986 was the moment the world stopped and stared in absolute awe. It was when the Philippines went from being a subject of history to a source of it, from a recipient of global trends to a creator of one. It was the moment the quiet, resilient spirit of the Filipino people roared so loudly it echoed across the planet. To understand 1986, you have to understand the 2 decades before it. The Philippines was under the authoritarian rule of Ferdinand Marcos. After he declared martial law in 1972, democracy was dismantled. Civil liberties were stripped, the press was silenced, and thousands of political opponents were arrested, tortured, or simply disappeared. Globally, the perception of the Philippines had soured. It was no longer the promising post-war republic. It was seen as a kleptocracy, a country defined by the extravagant and corrupt lifestyle of the ruling family, symbolized by Imelda Marcos's infamous shoe collection. While the Marcoses entertained world leaders and lived in luxury, the country was sinking into debt and poverty. To the outside world, the Philippines was often portrayed as a tragic case, just another third-world dictatorship, a geopolitical pawn in the Cold War, valuable to the US for its military bases, but otherwise a political basket case. The joke was back, but this time it was a dark, cynical one. The catalyst for change came on August 21, 1983. Opposition leader Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr., returning from exile, was assassinated on the tarmac of the Manila International Airport just moments after he landed. His famous words, "The Filipino is worth dying for," became a rallying cry that woke up a nation. The assassination ignited years of massive street protests. The anger that had been simmering for over a decade finally boiled over. The breaking point came in February 1986. Marcos, trying to legitimize his rule, called for a snap presidential election. His opponent was Ninoy's widow, Corazon Cory Aquino, a reluctant candidate who became the unifying symbol of the opposition. Marcos, through widespread fraud and intimidation, declared himself the winner. But this time, the people refused to accept it. What happened next, from February 22nd to the 25th, was something the world had never seen before. It became known as the People Power Revolution, or the EDSA Revolution, named after the main highway in Manila, where millions of people gathered. It started when a group of military rebels broke away from Marcos and barricaded themselves in a military camp. They were hugely outnumbered by loyalist forces. Then something incredible happened. Cardinal Jaime Sin, the Archbishop of Manila, went on the Catholic-run Radio Veritas and called on the people to go to EDSA to protect the rebels, to form a human shield. And the people came. In a matter of hours, the highway was a sea of humanity. They came from all walks of life: students, Office workers, farmers, the rich and the poor. They brought food, water, and faith. The revolution was televised, broadcast live to a stunned global audience. The world watched as nuns knelt in front of advancing tanks, holding rosaries. They saw young women placing flowers into the muzzles of soldiers' rifles. They saw crowds singing patriotic songs, standing firm but peaceful against the machinery of the state. Marcos ordered his military to attack. Pilots got in their helicopters and soldiers got in their tanks. But when they saw the sheer number of unarmed civilians, when they saw their own countrymen standing in their path, they refused. The soldiers defected. The pilots landed and joined the crowd. The regime crumbled, not with a bang, but with the collective, peaceful, unshakable will of a people. On February 25, 1986, Ferdinand Marcos and his family fled the country. The dictatorship was over. The global impact was immediate and profound. The Philippines became a global icon of democracy. It had provided a blueprint, a working model for how to peacefully overthrow a dictator. The EDSA revolution sent ripples across the globe, becoming a powerful touchstone for pro-democracy movements for years to come in places like South Korea, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. It was proof that a dictator could be toppled without a civil war. This was the moment the world stopped seeing the Philippines as a joke, a footnote, or a tragic case. It saw a nation of heroes. It saw a people whose courage and faith could topple a tyrant and inspire the world. The perception of the little brown brother was shattered and replaced by an image of a giant of democracy.